Welcome to the Caribbean True Crime YouTube channel, where we uncover the cases hiding beyond the headlines. From secluded islands and forgotten corners of the Caribbean, these are stories you may have never heard before until now. If you enjoy uncovering the unknown, like, subscribe, and leave a comment. And let's get into the case. September 25th, 1972, northern Montserrat. Along the roads running through the island, the morning began with the familiar rhythm of a small Caribbean community. Vehicles moving toward work, shops preparing to open, voices carrying through neighborhoods, and the volcanic landscape rising beyond the settlements. Then the police network came alive. An emergency dispatch went out to Royal Montserrat Police Service units along Northern Main Road. Within the close geography of the island, information moved quickly. Officers were directed toward the developing incident as word began spreading beyond the immediate scene. At 88.3 FM, JB Radio Montserrat interrupted its routine programming with an urgent police advisory. For an island accustomed to hearing familiar voices and local announcements over the radio, the change in tone was immediate. The broadcast carried the authority of an official warning, and listeners across Montserrat began paying attention. The message moved through homes, vehicles, businesses, and roadside gathering places. In the settlements around Salem and Braids, the reaction was immediate. Montserrat was a small community, and a police emergency could travel through the population with extraordinary speed. People recognized the roads. They knew the neighborhoods. They knew how quickly one part of the island connected to another. Police units moved toward the designated location, where first responders established a forensic cordon around a reinforced concrete block residence. The building became the center of a rapidly expanding police operation. Officers controlled access to the immediate area, preserving the scene while investigators began documenting what was before them. Beyond the cordon, the geography of northern Montserrat framed everything. The roads connected the settlements in a tight network. Braids and Salem were not distant urban centers separated by miles of open country. They were parts of a compact island community where news could move from one household to another almost as quickly as a vehicle could travel the road. The radio advisory intensified that effect. For residents listening to ZJB, the ordinary soundtrack of the morning had been replaced by the unmistakable language of an emergency. The police presence gave the announcement physical form. Vehicles on the roads, officers securing an address, movement around the residence, and people gathering at a cautious distance. The first response was therefore more than a police operation. It was the moment an ordinary morning across Montserrat began to fracture. Northern Main Road became part of an unfolding investigation. The reinforced concrete residence became a controlled scene. Salem and Braids absorbed the shock through streets and households. And over the airwaves, ZJB carried the first official warning into homes across the island. But the investigation would soon move beyond the immediate police cordon, back through the movements of the people involved, and toward the chain of events that brought authorities to that point. A small population, a narrow geography, a substantial public sector, and a private economy where individual businesses can be deeply embedded in community life. In such a place, relationships accumulate. A surname can connect one household to another. A workplace can contain several generations of the same family. A church congregation can include childhood friends, relatives, and colleagues. A shopkeeper may know a customer's parents. A public servant may have gone to school with the person standing across the counter. That interconnectedness can be a strength. It can also make information extraordinarily difficult to contain. Before Facebook notifications, before WhatsApp groups, before a post could be shared hundreds of times with a single tap, Montserrat already possessed a communications network capable of moving information rapidly. It operated through people, and when something serious happened, the first version of the story did not necessarily originate in a press release or police statement. It could begin quietly in a conversation between people who already knew one another. Then it could move from house to workplace, from workplace to roadside gathering, from roadside gathering to family, and eventually into the formal public record. On a small island, the distance between rumor and official information could be measured not in miles, but in relationships. September the 27th, 1972, Town Hill, Montserrat. The morning air around Plymouth carried the ordinary textures of a small Caribbean settlement. Vegetation crowding the roadsides, houses scattered through the hills, and residents moving through a landscape where familiar names and familiar faces were part of daily life. By then, the search for 16-year-old Sarah Melvina Meade had entered its third day. The investigation had begun with a missing person report at Plymouth Police Station on the evening of September 25th. Mon had last been seen alive at approximately 5:15 that morning, walking west along the northern side of George Street with a paper parcel beneath her arm. 2 days later, a shoe associated with her was found at the junction of Wall Street and Osborne Street. That discovery redirected the search toward Town Hill. The police response was conducted within the physical limitations of the neighborhood itself. There were no sprawling forensic compounds or modern crime scene vehicles. This was a 1972 investigation on a small island, carried out by Montserrat's Criminal Investigation Department. Among the officers involved were Sergeant Winfield Griffith and Inspector Sidney Charles and Patrick Paddy Lee, officers who lived within the same broader community they were investigating. The shoe became the immediate physical guide. After Glendora King spoke with John Diet on the morning of September 27th, Diet went to the junction of Wall and Osborne Streets, recovered the shoe, and took it to police. Officers then returned with him to the location. From there, a search moved into the surrounding vegetation. The terrain mattered. The body was located in a bushy area between the Coconut Hill Hotel and the premises of a member of the Wall family. The surrounding Town Hill landscape was a mixture of residential properties, established businesses, vegetation, and sloping ground. The area belonged to a part of Montserrat that had once been among the island's more prominent residential districts, with Government House, the Coconut Hill Hotel, and established business families forming part of its social geography. When officers located Monday, Dr. Philip Bailey was summoned to the scene at approximately 10:30 that morning. He examined the body where it had been found before it was transported to Glendon Hospital. The court record describes her lying within a clump of bushes, dressed in a mini dress, with the lower portion of her body uncovered. Her clothing and body were heavily soiled with dirt, grass, and vegetation. The environment had become part of the evidence. Grass and plant material adhered to the body and clothing. A clump of grass was found in her mouth. The condition of the remains reflected the approximately 2 days that had passed since her final confirmed sighting. The postmortem later recorded advanced decomposition, with the body affected by maggots and other decomposition processes. Dr. Bailey's examination documented extensive injuries to the head and face. The skull contained multiple fractures, including injuries around the facial bones, the left eye, the nose, and the temporal and right parietal regions. His medical conclusion was that death resulted from multiple injuries produced by blows from a blunt instrument. The physical scene supplied another crucial object. Sergeant Griffith noted a depression in the ground, approximately 5 feet 2 inches from the body. Nearby, roughly 3 feet 8 inches away, was a large stone. Griffith observed what appeared to be blood and human hair on it. He placed the stone into the depression, where it fitted the impression. The stone was subsequently transferred for examination by chemist Gerald Popplewell. Popplewell reported bundles of hair adhering to the stone at 3 separate points. The hair was identified as human hair that transformed an otherwise ordinary piece of the surrounding landscape into a significant item within the prosecution's physical evidence. The location itself also became important to the reconstruction. The depression, the stone, the vegetation, and the body's position were documented together, allowing investigators and later the courts to consider whether the injuries had been inflicted at that location and how the body had come to rest there. The medical evidence placed death within a broad period compatible with the disappearance. Dr. Bailey estimated approximately 48 hours before his examination, while placing the probable range at more than 24 and probably within 72 hours. Every physical detail, therefore, had to be interpreted against time. The final confirmed sighting occurred shortly after dawn on September 25th. The body was located during the morning of September 27th. Between those points, the island's ordinary geography, George Street, Fort Barrington Road, Wall Street, Osborne Street, Peebles Street, and the Town Hill surroundings became the framework through which investigators reconstructed movement. And in a community where people regularly recognize one another along those same roads, physical evidence was only one part of the investigation. The next stage would come from the people who had seen Mon, heard her name, encountered the suspects, and remembered conversations that suddenly carried a very different meaning after the discovery in the bushes. September 25th, 1972, Montserrat. The island was not under a modern airport and ferry security lockdown. There were no electronic passenger manifests being cross-checked by investigators, no digital vehicle recognition systems, and no network of modern checkpoints stretching across the island. The investigation operated through a much smaller and more personal system. Police stations, witnesses, roads, docks, workplaces, and the people who knew the terrain. Sarah Meade had last been seen alive at approximately 5:15 that morning, walking west along the northern side of George Street in Plymouth. Joseph White, a resident who knew her and regularly saw her in the morning, remembered the encounter. She was carrying a paper parcel beneath her arm. That ordinary journey would become the starting point for reconstructing her movements. By evening, the concern had become an official police investigation. Mon's stepfather, John Diet, had spent the day looking for her. After returning from the mountain at approximately 4 o'clock and finding that she had not returned home, he made inquiries around the community. Between approximately 6 and 7 p.m., he went to Plymouth Police Station and reported her missing. In a community as compact as Montserrat, that report immediately transformed the significance of familiar places. George Street was no longer simply the route Mon used after church. Fort Barrington Road was no longer simply another road through Town Hill. The streets around Plymouth became potential witnesses in their own right. Police began working outward from the information available to them. Residents were questioned. Movements were reconstructed. People who had encountered Mon were asked to remember when and where they had seen her. People who knew the men eventually investigated were brought into the developing picture. The investigation was therefore built around human observation. One particularly important line of inquiry concerned Fort Barrington Road. Several residents later testified that they had previously seen Joseph Meade Buffange call out to Mon as she passed along the road. Joseph Meade, Matilda Jenny Gage, and Henry Ryan each supplied evidence concerning encounters between Buffange and Mon. Those observations mattered because Montserrat's roads were not anonymous corridors. A person walking along a particular stretch could be recognized by people living nearby. A passing vehicle could be associated with its driver. A familiar face could be noticed because the community itself provided the reference point. The search continued into Tuesday. Then on the morning of September 27th, a new physical marker appeared. Glendora King visited John Diet's home and spoke with him. Following that conversation, Diet went to the junction of Wall Street and Osborne Street. There he found one of the shoes Mon had been wearing when she left home. He picked it up, carried it to the police station, and made a report. Police subsequently returned with him to the location, and he showed them exactly where the shoe had been found. That junction became a transit point of a different kind. The shoe gave investigators a fixed location from which they could expand their search. Officers moved into the surrounding area, eventually reaching a bushy section between the Coconut Hill Hotel and property associated with the Wall family. There they found Mon. The discovery fundamentally changed the investigation. The search for a missing girl became a homicide investigation. Every earlier sighting, every remembered movement, and every connection between the people involved acquired greater significance. The docs also entered the developing reconstruction. On the morning of September 25th, according to evidence later presented in court, Joseph Asia Blood Buffonge was aboard his boat near the northern part of the Plymouth Pier when George Fowl Lee approached him. The encounter became one of the central pieces of the prosecution's case against Buffonge and Lee. The pier was not an abstract location on a map. It was part of the working waterfront of Plymouth, a place where fishermen, laborers, and other residents could encounter one another during the course of an ordinary day. That was the essential character of the investigation. Montserrat's limited geography did not require sophisticated electronic tracking to reconstruct movement. Investigators had something more primitive and, in a community this small, potentially powerful, people who notice things. A girl walking before dawn, a man calling her name along a road, a missing person report filed that evening, a shoe discovered 2 mornings later, a body found after officers followed that physical trail into the vegetation, and witnesses whose memories gradually connected locations that at first glance appeared to be ordinary parts of the island. The investigation was becoming a map, not of electronic signals, but of human movement. And at the center of that map stood the roads, houses, waterfront, and hills of Town Hill, where investigators would begin assembling the evidence that ultimately brought 2 men before the courts. September the 28th, 1972, Town Hill, Montserrat. The morning after Sarah Meade's body had been found and recovered, the investigation turned toward a man who had returned to Montserrat only weeks earlier. His name was Joseph Meade Buffonge. He was 30 years old, a veteran seaman who described himself as a navigation officer with the Merchant Marine. He had returned to Montserrat from St. Croix on August 14th, roughly 6 weeks before Mon disappeared. By September 28th, police attention had settled on him. The first approach was deliberately ordinary. According to the later court record and the 2022 reconstruction, Inspector Patrick Paddy Lee went to the home of Buffonge's father, Jojo Look and Laugh Buffonge, in Tombeth, Town Hill. Meade was told that a telegram from St. Croix was waiting for him at the police station. He accompanied the officer there. Once inside the station, the atmosphere changed. Instead of being taken directly into an interview room, Buffonge was placed in the guard room and remained there for a period of time. He later recalled waiting until Inspector Lee returned, then waiting again while police dealt with the supposed telegram. Eventually, at approximately 2:30 p.m., he was taken to the Criminal Investigation Department, where he encountered Sergeant Winfield Griffith, Sergeant Samuel Amer, and other officers. The police had something specific to show him. Sergeant Griffith produced a warrant authorizing a search of his father's house for clothing connected with the dead girl. The warrant and the search brought the investigation directly into Buffonge's family environment. Officers and Buffonge then went to the residence, searched it, and recovered no clothing matching the purpose described in the warrant. The search continued elsewhere. The following day, officers took Buffonge to Fort Barrington Road, including the residence of Matilda Jenny Gage. Police asked about his clothing and examined garments at the property. Gage told them that Buffonge did not live there, and she identified clothing that belonged to her boyfriend rather than Buffonge. Officers subsequently searched a house rented to Buffonge from Mr. Meade before returning him to the station. Then came the formal questioning. On the morning of September 29th, at approximately 3 a.m., Buffonge was taken upstairs to the CID office. The later appellate record states that approximately 18 police officers were present, when Inspector Richard began questioning him about Sarah Meade. The questioning focused on the period surrounding Mon's disappearance. Buffon supplied an account of his movements between September 24th and September 27th. He described playing dominoes on 2 consecutive nights at a local bar, borrowing a book from the headmistress at Kinsale Primary School, and helping his father with chores. He also stated that he had not been on Peeble Street, where Mon's body was discovered, since returning from St. Croix on August 14th. Those assertions became part of the evidentiary record because investigators began testing them against other people's recollections. The interview also produced a striking exchange when police showed Buffon a photograph of Mon and asked whether he knew her. His response, as recorded in the later reconstruction, amounted to an emphatic denial of knowing her. That denial immediately collided with witness testimony. 3 Town Hill residents, Joseph Meade, Matilda Jenny Gage, and Henry Ryan, later testified that they had previously seen or heard Buffon call out to Mon while she traveled along Fort Barrington Road. Their evidence placed the two within the same physical environment before the disappearance and directly challenged Buffon's attempt to distance himself from knowing the teenager. The investigation was therefore shifting from a search for a missing person into a reconstruction of relationships. Who knew Mon? Who had encountered her on the roads? Who had seen Buffon around Town Hill? And which parts of his account could be matched against independent witnesses? The police work was not confined to the station. Searches had already extended across family properties and locations associated with Buffon. Witnesses were being revisited. Earlier encounters were being re-examined. The geography of Fort Barrington Road, Peeble Street, and Town Hill was being connected to statements gathered from residents. Then came the arrest. On October 3, 1972, after the investigation had developed through searches, witness accounts, and questioning, Joseph Mida Buffon was formally arrested and charged with the murder of Sarah Mon Meade. The following day, police turned toward another Town Hill man. George Fall Lee, 31 years old, worked as a garbage collector and laborer and had been a long-time fishing associate of Buffon. He was brought in for questioning on October 4th. His co-workers, Henry Mussolini KB, Beresford, Lord Hales Lovin, and Samuel Black Sam Amer would become significant witnesses because of what they said Lee had told them early on the morning Mon disappeared. On October 5th, Lee was arrested and charged with murder. The case now had 2 defendants, but the evidence against them would not rest solely on what happened inside a police station. It would expand through the testimony of co-workers, relatives, prisoners, and residents, eventually reaching the courtroom where the entire chronology of those September days would be tested. September 1972, Montserrat. The investigation into Sarah Mon Meade's death was unfolding in an era when forensic science existed, but the infrastructure available to a small Caribbean island was fundamentally different from what investigators can access today. There was no regional security system aircraft carrying sealed evidence between islands. The RSS itself did not yet exist. It was established in 1982, a decade after Mon's murder. The UK's Modern Forensic Science Service was also created later, in 1991, and the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office did not exist under that name until 2020. The forensic story of Mon's case therefore belongs to an earlier system: local police investigation, a government medical practitioner, chemical examination, physical evidence, and courtroom testimony. On the morning of September 27, 1972, Dr. Philip W. Bailey examined Mon's body at the discovery site before it was taken to Glendon Hospital. At approximately 1 p.m., he conducted the postmortem examination. The medical findings became one of the principal scientific components of the prosecution case. Bailey documented multiple injuries to the head and face. The skull contained several fractures, including injuries around the facial bones, eye region, and temporal and parietal areas. His conclusion was, that death had resulted from multiple blows with a blunt instrument. The body had already undergone substantial decomposition by the time of examination. That affected the type of conclusions that could safely be drawn. The court record describes decomposition, maggots, and other changes to the remains, while Bailey's estimate placed death approximately 48 hours before his examination, with a wider possible range. Then investigators turned to the ground surrounding the body. Sergeant Winfield Griffith noticed a depression in the earth approximately 5 feet 2 inches from the body. Nearby was a large stone. Griffith observed what appeared to be blood and human hair on its surface. When he placed the stone into the depression, it fitted the impression. That object became one of the most important physical exhibits. It was sent to chemist Gerald Popplewell for examination. Popplewell reported finding bundles of hair adhering to the stone at 3 separate points and identified the hair as human. The results supplied scientific support for the prosecution's argument that the stone had been involved in the fatal assault. This was forensic science operating on the scale available to Montserrat at the beginning of the 1970s. The evidence did not require modern DNA profiling. It did not require ballistic databases. It did not require toxicology panels transmitted electronically to an overseas laboratory. Instead, investigators relied on the combination of medical examination, chemical analysis, physical exhibits, and testimony. The court would eventually have to decide what those individual pieces meant when placed beside the eyewitness evidence. The case therefore demonstrates an important distinction between forensic evidence and modern forensic infrastructure. The island's police could recover an object. A medical practitioner could document injuries. A chemist could examine material recovered from that object. But the investigation still depended heavily on people. That dependence is visible throughout the appellate judgment. Witnesses supplied observations about Mon's movements. Residents described encounters on Fort Barrington Road. Co-workers testified about statements allegedly made by George Fall Lee. Prisoners testified about conversations attributed to Joseph Meade Buffange. Police officers described searches, discoveries, and physical exhibits. The forensic material had to be interpreted within that larger human framework. There was also a geographic advantage to the investigation. Montserrat was small enough that the relevant locations could be reconstructed through direct observation. George Street, Fort Barrington Road, Wall Street, Osborne Street, Peeble Street, and the Town Hill area formed a relatively concentrated landscape. The body was discovered in vegetation between the Coconut Hill Hotel and property associated with the Wall family. The shoe was recovered at the Wall Street-Osborne Street junction. The prosecution's witnesses described encounters with Buffange along Fort Barrington Road. The physical evidence consequently became a series of fixed points. The body, the shoe, the depression, the stone, the hair, the roads connecting them, and the people who supplied the human chronology between those points. By the time the case reached the assizes in July 1973, those elements had been transformed into courtroom exhibits and testimony. The scientific evidence could establish injuries. The chemical examination could establish that human hair was present on the stone. The witnesses could place individuals and movements within the landscape, but the jury still had to perform the final task, deciding whether the combined evidence proved murder beyond reasonable doubt. That decision would come in the Plymouth courthouse on July 24, 1973, and when the verdict arrived, it would send 2 men toward death sentences and create a legal chain of events that would become almost as extraordinary as the murder itself. October 1972, Montserrat. The investigation had moved from the streets of Town Hill into the machinery of the colonial criminal courts. Joseph Meade Buffange and George Fowl Lee had been arrested and charged with Sarah Meade's murder on October 3rd and October 5th, respectively. They were then remanded into custody, beginning a period of incarceration that would last through the winter and into the following year's preliminary proceedings. The surviving appellate record confirms that Bouffange was taken before a magistrate after police questioning and remanded in prison. The legal process was deliberately slower than the pace of the investigation. Montserrat's Assizes Court convened only 3 times each year, in March, July, and November. Because the 2 men were arrested in October, they had missed the November sitting. Their next major court stage would therefore come in March 1973. That interval placed both defendants inside the island's correctional system while prosecutors assembled the case. The jail became an important secondary setting in the investigation because conversations attributed to Bouffange during his remand would later become prosecution evidence. The appellate judgment records testimony concerning statements allegedly made by Bouffange while he was in custody. One of the witnesses was George Cooper, another prisoner, whose evidence concerned Bouffange's alleged account of the disposal of Mon's body. The prison environment therefore became part of the evidentiary chain. A statement allegedly made inside custody could later emerge in court through another prisoner. What began as a conversation behind prison walls could become testimony before a jury months later. Meanwhile, the prosecution was building its preliminary case. In March 1973, the preliminary inquiry finally took place. According to the later historical reconstruction, 27 witnesses submitted depositions. They included Mon's relatives, associates of the defendants, police investigators, and residents of the island. The witness list reflected the intensely local character of the investigation. There were family members, police officers, co-workers, residents, people who had encountered the defendants, and people whose evidence concerned conversations allegedly held after the murder. Among the witnesses was Joseph Asia Blood Bouffange, Meade's cousin and the prosecution's central eyewitness. His account, first presented during the March preliminary inquiry, described an encounter at the Plymouth waterfront on September 25th and subsequent events at the home of Meade's father in Town Hill. His evidence would later form one of the central pillars of the Crown's case at the Assizes. The preliminary proceedings therefore served a critical function. They placed the prosecution's witnesses and their accounts into the formal legal record before the trial itself. By then, the case had grown considerably beyond the original missing person investigation. The police had recovered Mon's shoe. Her body had been examined by Dr. Philip Bailey. A stone recovered near the body had been examined by chemist Gerald Popplewell, who reported human hair adhering to it. Residents had supplied evidence concerning Bouffange's encounters with Mon and Lee's co-workers, had described conversations they said he had held on the morning of September 25th. And prisoners had supplied evidence concerning statements allegedly made while the defendants were in custody. Each strand entered the legal process through testimony and depositions. The defense would eventually have the opportunity to challenge those accounts before a jury. But first came the long wait between committal and assizes. For Bouffange and Lee, the next destination was the Plymouth courthouse, where the trial would eventually begin on July 16, 1973, more than 9 months after the arrests. By then, the case had become the most closely watched criminal proceeding in modern Montserratian memory. The courthouse itself would become a spectacle. Crowds gathered around Parliament Street. People who could not secure seats inside watched from outside. School children gathered near the courthouse windows. John Stanley Weeks, then serving as a magistrate and court registrar, later recalled opening the doors each morning and managing the rush of people trying to enter. The preliminary hearing had begun the transformation of the investigation into a courtroom case. Now the evidence was assembled. The defendants were in custody. The witnesses had been identified. The lawyers had been appointed. And Montserrat was waiting for the assizes to open its doors. The next stage would place the prosecution's entire narrative before a jury and force every witness, every statement, and every physical exhibit into the unforgiving structure of a murder trial. July 16, 1973, Plymouth, Montserrat. The doors of the courthouse on Parliament Street opened onto a community that had spent 10 months living with the weight of one question. Who killed 16-year-old Sarah Meade? Inside, Joseph Mida Buffonge and George Fall Lee faced the Crown's case. Outside, Montserrat gathered around the proceedings. This was not a distant courtroom drama involving strangers from another jurisdiction. The witnesses, defendants, lawyers, police officers, and jurors belonged to the same small island. The streets described in testimony were the streets through which people traveled every day. The trial lasted 8 days. The prosecution's case was built primarily through circumstantial evidence and testimony, rather than the modern forensic technologies later associated with homicide investigations. The Crown presented evidence about Mon's final movements, Buffonge's relationship with her, the discovery of her body, the physical evidence recovered near the scene, and statements allegedly made by the defendants. At the center of the case against Buffonge stood Joseph Asia Blood Buffonge, his cousin. Asia Blood's testimony described events surrounding September 25th and placed Buffonge at the center of the prosecution's reconstruction. He testified about encounters involving Buffonge and Mon and about what he said occurred after Mon's death. His evidence was particularly important because it connected the accused to the circumstances surrounding the body. The defense attacked the reliability of that testimony. Asia Blood had his own criminal history, and his credibility was challenged before the jury. The defense urged the court to examine his evidence carefully, particularly where it conflicted with other testimony or depended upon recollections of events occurring rapidly over the course of the September 25th morning. The prosecution also relied upon witnesses who had encountered Buffonge and Mon along Fort Barrington Road. Joseph Meade, Matilda Jenny Gage, and Henry Ryan gave evidence concerning Buffonge calling out to Mon as she passed. That evidence became significant because Buffonge's own account attempted to distance him from any meaningful acquaintance with the teenager. The Crown then connected those encounters to the physical geography of Town Hill. Mon had been seen alive on George Street shortly after dawn. Her shoe was later found at the junction of Wall Street and Osborne Street. Her body was discovered in a bushy area near Peeble Street, between the Coconut Hill Hotel and property associated with the Wall family. The prosecution argued that these locations form part of a continuous sequence. The physical evidence provided another layer. Sergeant Winfield Griffith testified about a depression in the ground near the body and a large stone found nearby. Griffith observed what appeared to be blood and human hair on the stone. Chemist Gerald Popplewell subsequently examined it and reported human hair adhering to its surface. The defense had to confront that evidence while emphasizing the limits of what it could establish. The stone could connect physical material to an object found near the body. The medical examination could establish the nature of the injuries. But those findings did not, by themselves, identify every movement made by the accused or establish every stage of the prosecution's reconstruction. That distinction became central to the trial. The defense challenged the prosecution's chronology. Witnesses had supplied different estimates of times. Mon's final confirmed sighting was placed at approximately 5:15 a.m. on September 25th, while other testimony concerned events occurring later that morning. The defense emphasized discrepancies between individual accounts and argued that the timeline could not be treated as a perfectly synchronized sequence. The trial judge ultimately directed the jury on how those discrepancies should be assessed. The prosecution did not need to establish an exact minute of death. The question was whether the evidence, taken together, established that Mon had been unlawfully killed during the relevant period and that the accused participated in that killing. The case against George Lee followed a different path. Lee worked as a garbage collector and laborer and was a longtime fishing associate of Buffonge. 3 co-workers, Henry Mussolini Cabey, Beresford Lord Hales Loving, and Samuel Black Sam Amer, gave evidence about conversations with Lee on the morning of September 25th. Their testimony was potentially damaging because they said Lee spoke about a young girl being missing before Mon's family had formally reported her disappearance. The prosecution presented that knowledge as highly significant. If Lee knew that a girl was missing before the information had formally circulated, the Crown argued, his knowledge could be considered alongside his relationship with Buffonge and the other circumstances surrounding the case. The defense attacked the inference. Knowing something about a crime was not automatically equivalent to committing it, and that distinction would eventually become decisive. The courtroom also had to separate community knowledge from legally admissible proof. In a place as interconnected as Montserrat, information could circulate rapidly through family networks, workplaces, and friendships, but a jury could not convict simply because a story had become widely believed. The evidence had to come through witnesses and exhibits presented according to the rules of the court. That principle became especially important because the prosecution's case was cumulative. One witness supplied a sighting, another supplied a conversation, another supplied evidence about movements. A medical practitioner supplied the post-mortem findings. A chemist supplied the laboratory examination of the stone. Police officers supplied the discovery and search evidence. Prisoners later supplied testimony concerning statements allegedly made by Buffonge while in custody. The jury had to consider those strands together. The defense, meanwhile, sought to pull them apart, to show where recollections differed, where inferences went beyond what a witness had actually observed, and where suspicious circumstances could support more than one interpretation. There was no modern DNA profile identifying a perpetrator. There was no digital location history placing a telephone at a particular address. There was no contemporary surveillance system reconstructing movement through the streets. The case was therefore fought through the evidence available in 1973. People, places, physical exhibits, medical findings, and statements. And the geography remained crucial. Every important movement had to fit into the compact landscape of Town Hill and Plymouth, George Street, Fort Barrington Road, Wall Street, Osborne Street, Peebles Street, the waterfront, the houses, the vegetation, the distances between them. The jury had to decide whether the prosecution's reconstruction was sufficiently coherent to establish guilt beyond reasonable doubt. On July 24th, 1973, after 8 days of testimony and legal argument, the jury returned its verdict. Both Buffonge and Lee were found guilty of murder. Justice Franklin Adams imposed the death sentence on each man. For the courtroom, it was the end of the trial. For the legal system, however, it was only the beginning of another battle. Within hours, the judge who had pronounced those sentences would die unexpectedly after attending dinner at the home of former Chief Minister William H. Bramble in Groves. And that extraordinary event would soon become more than a tragic footnote. It would change the legal fate of the men the jury had just condemned. September 1972, Montserrat. The roads of Town Hill had always been part of a community where distance was measured in familiar faces. A walk to church could become a conversation with a neighbor. A stop at a shop could bring news from another family. Children knew one another across village boundaries, and adults carried generations of relationships with them wherever they went. Then Sarah Meade was killed. She was 16 years old. Her death struck a community already accustomed to knowing where people were supposed to be, which roads they normally traveled, which homes they visited, and which families were connected to one another. Mon herself had lived within that network. Her Sunday routine brought her to the Roman Catholic Church on George Street, followed by an overnight stay with her great-aunt Charlotte Lynch and great-grandmother Christiana Bazzi. The following morning, she would normally make the journey back toward Victoria Village. That routine gave her disappearance an immediate human dimension. Her family expected her home. Her stepfather expected to meet her in the hills. Her mother expected her to return. When she did not, the ordinary rhythms of the household began to break apart. The search eventually led to the discovery of her body in a bushy area near Peebles Street. By then, the streets and landmarks that had defined her ordinary life had become part of a homicide investigation. The community was forced to look at familiar places differently. A road where children walked could now be associated with danger. A quiet stretch between houses could become a place people remembered. A familiar face could suddenly carry a new significance because that person had been questioned, mentioned by a witness, or connected to one of the accused. The psychological effect of a violent crime in a small island community is amplified by proximity. Montserrat was not a metropolis where thousands of strangers passed through every day without recognition. People belonged to families, churches, workplaces, and neighborhoods. The same surnames appeared across generations. The same community institutions brought people together repeatedly. Mon's family was therefore grieving within the same social environment in which the investigation was unfolding. Her mother, Sarah Diet, her stepfather, John Darda Diet, and her younger sister, Rachel, were not grieving from a distance. The streets surrounding them carried memories of Mon's life. George Street connected her to church. Victoria Village connected her to home. The hills connected her to her stepfather's daily work. Town Hill became associated with the investigation that followed her death, and the courthouse on Parliament Street became the place where those memories were transformed into testimony. The trial itself intensified the community's exposure to the case. For 8 days in July 1973, residents gathered around the Plymouth courthouse. People watched the defendants enter. Witnesses came forward. Jurors were isolated at the Coconut Hill Hotel. The testimony repeatedly brought the community back to the same roads and homes where people had lived their ordinary lives. The effect was not confined to the courtroom. The case changed the way people thought about movement. A young woman walking alone before sunrise was no longer simply following a familiar route. The roads themselves became objects of attention. Who was nearby? Who had been seen along the way? Which houses were occupied? Which stretches were isolated? Who might recognize a passing vehicle or a person walking along the road? These questions emerged from the circumstances of Mon's death and became part of the community's collective awareness. That is one of the defining consequences of serious violence in a small territory. Trust becomes personal. People do not simply trust an anonymous neighborhood. They trust particular people, a shopkeeper, a neighbor, a church member, a childhood friend, a relative. When a violent crime enters that network, the emotional impact reaches beyond the immediate victim and accused. The case also demonstrated the power of Montserrat's churches and community institutions as places where people could encounter one another, exchange information, and support families during difficult periods. Mon's connection to the Catholic Church made that institution part of the story from the beginning because her Sunday evening routine began there. Her life was rooted in community. So was her disappearance, and so was the grief that followed. Decades later, people who had known Mon continued to remember her personality, her athletic ability, her humor, and her relationships. Her athletic achievements in particular remain part of her legacy. At 16, she had already won the junior mile at the inaugural Leeward Islands Track and Field Championships in Basseterre in 1972. That matters because the historical record can easily reduce a victim to the circumstances of her death. Mon was more than a name in a murder file. She was a daughter, a sister, a granddaughter, a church member, a friend, a young athlete with a future extending far beyond the roads where her final journey began. The volcanic transformation that would later reshape Montserrat would physically erase or alter many of the island's southern landmarks. But the memory of Mon's case survived through the people who remembered her and through the court records that preserved the investigation. Her story became part of Montserrat's history, not simply because a murder occurred, but because the murder struck at something fundamental to island life. The assumption that familiar communities offer familiarity, recognition, and safety. Afterward, the roads were still there, the churches were still there, families still gathered, people still knew one another. But the innocence of moving through those places had been altered, and as the legal consequences of the case began unfolding, another fracture was about to appear, not in the streets of Town Hill, but inside the verdict itself. July 24th, 1973, Plymouth, Montserrat. The verdict arrived in the late afternoon, after 8 days of testimony that had drawn an entire island toward the courthouse on Parliament Street. The jury found Joseph Mida Buffonge and George Fowl Lee guilty of murdering 16-year-old Sarah Meade. Both men were sentenced to death, but the verdict did not end the case. On October 23, 1973, the Court of Appeal of Montserrat heard the two men's appeals together. The central question was no longer simply what the jury had believed. The appellate court examined whether the trial judge had properly directed the jury on the evidence and the legal requirements for conviction. The result fractured the verdict. For Buffonge, the Court of Appeal found the prosecution's case sufficiently strong that the alleged misdirections at trial did not affect the outcome. His appeal was dismissed, and his conviction stood. For Lee, the court reached the opposite conclusion. The judges held that the evidence did not establish a sufficiently firm agreement or positive physical participation by Lee in the actual killing. The trial judge's directions concerning Lee were therefore inadequate. His conviction was quashed. That distinction is one of the most important facts in the entire case. The original trial had produced 2 guilty verdicts. The appellate court did not treat the 2 defendants as legally interchangeable. One conviction survived, the other did not. The legal record, therefore, leaves Sarah's murder with 2 very different judicial outcomes. Buffonge remained convicted. Lee's conviction was overturned. And that is where the historical record becomes more powerful than the headline. Sarah was not the verdict. She was 16 years old when she died. She had been living with her mother and stepfather in Victoria Village and had developed a routine of spending Sunday nights with her great-aunt Charlotte Lynch and great-grandmother Christiana Barzy in George Street. On the morning of September 25, 1972, she was seen walking west along George Street. She was never seen alive again. 2 mornings later, her shoe was discovered at the junction of Wall and Osborne Streets. A police search led investigators into a bushy area between the Coconut Hill Hotel and property associated with the Wall family, where her body was found. Those places have changed with time. Montserrat itself has changed. The volcanic crisis that began in 1995 transformed the island's geography and displaced much of its population. Plymouth, the same town whose courthouse became the center of the 1973 trial, was subsequently abandoned after the Soufriere Hills eruptions. The island's modern population is concentrated largely in the north, but the landscape surrounding Sarah's story retains its historical importance. The sea surrounds the island, the hills rise above it, the roads connect communities separated by relatively short physical distances, and the volcano remains part of the island's identity. The final lesson of the Meade case is therefore not about some imagined modern forensic system that existed in 1972. There was no DNA database reconstructing Sarah's final movements, no smartphone location record, and no regional security system transporting evidence between Caribbean laboratories. Those technologies and institutions belong to later decades. The actual investigation depended upon the tools of its time: eyewitness testimony, police work, medical examination, chemical analysis, and physical exhibits. A stone, human hair, a shoe, a medical examination, witnesses who remembered encounters along familiar roads, and statements attributed to people connected to the accused. The appellate judgment preserves that evidentiary architecture decades later. It also preserves something more difficult to quantify: the scale of the community's attention. When the trial opened in July 1973, People crowded around the Plymouth courthouse. Workers gathered outside. School children watched through the building's windows. The surviving accounts describe an island intensely focused on a case involving people they knew and places they recognized. That intensity did not disappear when the courtroom emptied. Later recollections describe residents becoming more cautious about locking their homes and women traveling alone after subsequent violent incidents. A surviving juror, Joseph Galloway, recalled the jury's sequestration at the Coconut Hill Hotel and the enduring bond formed among jurors during the trial. That is perhaps the most enduring image of the case. Not the courtroom, not the sentence, not even the disputed testimony. A small island, remembering a 16-year-old girl. Sarah Meade's life began and ended within a community where roads, churches, homes, and families were tightly woven together. Her athletic achievements, her church life, her family relationships, and the ordinary routine that preceded her disappearance all existed before the murder transformed her name into a criminal case. The verdict became history. The appeal became law. But Sarah remained a person. And beyond the courthouse, beyond the roads of Old Plymouth, and beyond the volcanic landscape that would later reshape Montserrat, that is the memory worth carrying forward. At dusk, the northern roads settle back into the rhythm of island life. The trade winds move through the vegetation. The sea continues beyond the coastline. Far to the south, the landscape of the exclusion zone bears the scars of a volcano that changed Montserrat forever. The island endured that transformation. It endured the loss of Plymouth. It endured displacement, economic upheaval, and the scattering of families across the Caribbean and beyond. And it carried Sarah's story with it. The case demonstrates something fundamental about justice in a small community. A conviction is a legal conclusion, not a substitute for memory. Courts decide guilt according to evidence and law. Communities carry the human consequences for much longer. For Sarah Meade, the final image should therefore not be the accused standing before a judge. It should be the 16-year-old girl who walked out into a Montserrat morning carrying the ordinary expectations of another day. The road continued ahead of her, and decades later, the island still remembers her name, Sarah Meade,